For years, the old school renaissance has remained a very niche part of the D&D hobby. I remember 10 years ago even when the idea that you could make $10 or $20 or $30,000 on Kickstarter for an OSR product would have seemed completely insane. But all of that changed in 2023. By my count, 14 different old school Kickstarters made over $100,000 that year. 8 of them made over $300,000, and 4 of them, including my own game Knave, made over $600,000. But by far, the biggest winners from that year were 2 games, Shadowdark by Kelsey Dion and Dolmenwood by Gavin Norman. Both of these games made over $1.3 million each, something that was virtually unheard of in the old school space. The only game that had ever achieved that before was Mothership from a couple years before. In fact, their success was so pronounced that they became 2 of the 5 highest grossing RPG Kickstarters of the entire year, beating out other established properties like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or The One Ring or The Walking Dead. They made hundreds of thousands of dollars more than every other non-5e product. Why was this happening? Was this a fluke or part of a continuing trend? Was the explosive growth of 5e over the last decade beginning to slow down? In order to answer these questions, I'm going to be talking today to a number of OSR creators whose products really took off recently, and we will be doing a deep dive into the data of RPGs on Kickstarter, looking at the OSR's growth over time, and especially comparing that to how 5e has fared over the same period. So to start with, here's Kelsey Dion of Shadowdark RPG and Chris McDowell, who created Mythic Bastionland, on why they thought the OSR did so well in 2023.
I don't think there's any single answer to this question, and certainly the OGL crisis helped pretty much everybody who's not D&D to get more sales. But I think that one thing you'll find in common with all of the creators who had really successful Kickstarters is that each of them brought a really big pre-existing audience along with them. I know that's the case for Ben Milton with Knave 2E, and definitely the case for Gavin Norman with Dolmenwood. And I can say in my case, I brought about 30,000 people from my newsletter, along with about 5 to 6 years worth of audience that I've built up by putting out material during that time. So I can say, at least in my case for sure, based on the numbers, that the biggest source of backers came from my newsletter. And I would hazard to guess that that's similar for the other Kickstarters that did really well.
In terms of why I think there's been this kind of explosion of sort of OSR style games suddenly having this big success on Kickstarter, I actually kind of think it's probably not so much of a big sudden thing as it looks. I think for a number of them, so things like Shadowdark, Dolmenwood, myself with Mythic Bastionland, these are games where the creators involved have kind of spent quite a long time building up an audience. And with things like Mothership and Knave, they're even like, second editions really. Of games that have built up a sort of quite a large following over the years. So I think in some sense we're kind of seeing the fruits of the labours that have been going on for quite a while with some of these games. I also think there might be a bit of a compounding effect where it's very difficult to get somebody to buy their first non-D&D game, and it's very difficult to get someone to back their first Kickstarter. But once they've done it once, it's much easier for them to take the plunge again because they've kind of they've overcome that initial hurdle. So I think with every one of these big Kickstarters, it kind of helps open the door a little bit for other Kickstarters because there's always people that are coming into this as a new thing, and people who came in with say Mothership or Break as their first Kickstarter or their first non-D&D RPG, they may well have also picked up Mythic Bastionland or Knave or other games as well. And I think there is a general sense of, certainly for myself, I feel like I have a much better understanding now of what it takes to have a successful RPG Kickstarter, as opposed to maybe when I did Electric Bastionland a few years ago. I think things like artwork and marketing, that they're not going to necessarily make or break the project, but they can be things that really help give it kind of like the icing on the cake for marketing, perhaps. But I think the artwork, understanding the importance of artwork is crucial. That's the thing that I would really sort of point to as a really important area of knowledge to understand for sort of marketing your game.
I think Kelsey's point about the OGL is really important. At the beginning of 2023, Wizards made an enormous blunder and canceled the OGL, the Open Gaming License, which a lot of publishers used as the basis for making D&D compatible products. This created a huge backlash against official D&D books, and I have no doubt that a lot of game masters and players went out there looking for alternatives, and the OSR was just there waiting to snap them up. But I think what Klozee and Chris said about bringing your own audience is probably even more important. One of the big things that tied together almost all of the big Kickstarter campaigns from last year was that those creators were bringing in thousands or tens of thousands of people from a built-in audience that they had created over the course of years. This was certainly true for me for my game Knave 2nd Edition. You simply cannot rely on Kickstarter and on advertisers to do all of your work for you if you want to have a really big campaign. What you need is a newsletter. The problem with so many publishers out there right now is that they are using social media, whether that be Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, to build their audience. They do not own these platforms, and therefore they do not have control over those contacts. Those platforms are going to decide for you when and if you can talk to your fans. And at some point in the future, when those platforms no longer exist, because none of them last forever, you're going to lose access to all of those people. That's a terrible business model. A much smarter way to do it is to collect emails, often from a newsletter. I do this myself with the Gladizant newsletter, which I use to put out information about OSR things and old school gaming that's happening around the internet. When you have a newsletter, you have an email list. An email list is a permanent contact because people don't change their emails much. And even if your newsletter provider goes down, you can just download that list of emails and take it to a new provider, and you're good to go again. More and more people in the OSR are realizing how valuable it is to have this email list, and they are using that to have bigger and bigger Kickstarters. But I think another reason why the OSR is having such a big influx is because, well, D&D 5e has been out for 10 years. That's a long time. It brought in a huge wave of new players, where those players are now been playing for around a decade, and they're probably looking for something to shake their game up. It's often very difficult for people to switch over to something very non-D&D, and the OSR hits that middle ground of being pretty similar, familiar enough to 5e players, but also different enough to feel fresh and interesting. I think also that game masters are really starting to realize how much easier it is to prep and run OSR games versus 5e stuff. And the ability to bring in lots of game masters is really the key to a game's health. But how fast really has the OSR been growing on Kickstarter, and how does that compare to 5e? To answer that question, I turn to Hans Messersmith, who is a mod over at RPGgeek.com and has been painstakingly collecting funding data from RPG Kickstarters by hand for years now and collecting tons of amazing data. When I asked Hans about how the OSR has grown, he volunteered to go through all of that data, again, by hand, and figure this out, an enormous undertaking for which I am extremely grateful. Let's take a look at what he revealed. But first, a quick shout out to today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Awaken Realms Vault's second campaign, Heroes and Companions, now funding on GameFound. This campaign features unique miniatures of most of the popular hero and class combinations from D&D, as well as companions to assist you in battle, like imps, lions, ravens, giant spiders, and pseudo-dragons. I think my favorite feature, though, is the incredibly beautiful story dice sets, which let you roll for activities, behavior, reactions, weather, and more. There's also a set of blessed and cursed dice if you want to tweak the odds. The campaign is ending on April 11th, so check them out using the link in the description. Okay, to start with, here is a chart of all of the OSR associated Kickstarters projects per year. We went back 10 years, that's a nice chunk of time, and it compares it well against 5e, which has been around for about 10 years. As you can see, it's divided into two colors, green for scene and yellow for original. This is because we wanted to divide it into two parts. Original represents OSR products that are like retro clones, things that are very strictly compatible and related to the early versions of D&D, as well as supplements for those things. The green stuff, the scene products, are works that are heavily inspired by the OSR playstyle. They may or may not be very compatible with early D&D stuff, but the approach to how the game works and what a campaign looks like is very similar. A good example of a scene product might be something like Mothership, or even my own game Maze Rats. Of course, there is no way to perfectly divide up products into these two categories. Some judgment calls were required, but I think this is broadly correct. As you can see, the number of products stayed about the same, around 20 or so, over the course of the first 5 years, and then it started really taking off in 2019, jumping up to 190 scene products and 71 original or classic products by 2023. Definitely a lot of growth happening here. Now let's look at the same chart, but we're going to look at how much money was brought in by these products. And we can see that it is growing much faster than the number of actual products being kickstarted. The products are making a lot more money, in other words. And the vast majority of this money is coming from the scene side of the OSR, from works that are inspired by old-school D&D and its playstyle, with almost $8 million brought in 2023. By the way, all of these charts will be down in the description below if you want to look through them yourself. All right, let's move on to something a little bit more juicy. This is the Kickstarter products per year, but also including products that are not from the OSR. So up at the top here, you can still see the green and the yellow, which is the scene and the original OSR categories. We also have the red category, which is everything else, and blue, which is 5e. So the red is everything that isn't OSR or 5e. You can see that the number of 5e products started out very low at only 4 down here at the bottom in 2014, and then grew very quickly over time till we have today 633 5e products being made last year. 2021 is interesting in that you can see there was kind of a big bump right there, which is basically a pandemic bump. A lot of people were stuck indoors getting into D&D, and a lot of things got sold that year. This is even more dramatic if we switch over to how much money all of these categories made. You can see that there was a massive spike in 2021. Although it is important to point out that a large chunk of this, around $9 million or so from the all other category, is just the Avatar role-playing game by Magpie, which was a mega success. 5e had a really big jump from 2020, which is around $13 million, to $32 million the next year, but then it dropped down afterwards and has not gotten back up to that level since then. In contrast to this, the OSR has just continued to grow year after year after year, taking up a larger share of the total amount of money being made on Kickstarter in role-playing games. This chart here takes each year and breaks each down proportionally, where we can see how much of each year was 5e, how much was OSR, and how much was everything else in relation to one another. This is just the number of products right here. And it's interesting to see how the OSR and the 5e, generally speaking, continue to grow in terms of number of products and are starting to squeeze out, so to speak, the number of products from everything else. And here's what it looks like when you look at the money proportionally from all of these campaigns. By the time you get to 2023, 5e is 49% of all of the money made on Kickstarter in the role-playing game sector. And the OSR is 13.9 plus 1.6, so around 15%, a bit more than that. Meanwhile, the percentage of money from everything else is around 1/3, 34-35%, whereas if you go back, it was 75%, 87%, and so forth. As of this year, 5e and the OSR together take up around 2/3 of all of the money spent on Kickstarter role-playing games. Now, this is all very interesting, but one of my biggest questions was, how does the growth of the OSR compare to that of 5e? I thought that was interesting because, as you can see here, the OSR does seem to grow pretty regularly over time in terms of the percentage, and 5e grows very quickly at the beginning and then seems to be sloping off. Let's take a look at that in more detail. What I did is I took the amount of money from each of these categories year by year and compared one year to the next, going forward over the last 5 years or so. And what I found was this. While it's certainly the case that over the first 5 years of this 10-year span we've been studying, 5e grew faster than the OSR. It was a brand new system. It took over the whole world. Everyone was very excited about it. Over the most recent 5 years, the OSR has actually grown faster every year than 5e has. So from 2018 to 2019, the 5e growth rate was 1.36. Basically, that means that in 2019, the amount of money was 1.36 times more than 2018, if that makes sense. And in the OSR, it grew by 1.45, slightly faster. The next year, 1.70 for 5e and 2 for the OSR. So the OSR basically doubled in size. 2020 to 2021 was basically neck and neck, with the OSR only slightly ahead. Now, the year after that, 5e actually saw a reduction because 2021 was such an enormous explosion. It was an anomalous year. It shot up really high for 5e. It collapsed down the next year. But this did not happen to the OSR, which continued to grow at a pretty normal pace. And then finally, from 22 to 23, 5e got back to growing again, and the OSR once again grew even faster. Now, what can we take away from all of this? Is this proof that the OSR will take over the entire hobby? 5e will be destroyed and everyone will be playing old-school D&D from now on? I don't think so. 5e is a powerhouse and it's going to remain that for a very long time. Also, what's happened in the past is no predictor of what's going to happen in the future. I don't know if the OSR will continue to grow at this rate year after year forever. But it is clear to me that the OSR is becoming much more mainstream than it has been in the past, and that people's enthusiasm for 5e is beginning to wear off and its growth is starting to slow. A decade into 5e's reign, a lot of its players are beginning to take a look back at earlier editions. Where did all these rules come from? Are earlier editions just bad old games that you can't learn from? Or is there a lot of great material there, both in adventures and in playstyle and in rules, that could be adapted for the modern day? They're discovering a lot of the same things that people in the OSR blogging scene discovered all of those years ago. And I think that's a great sign for the health of the hobby. Well, that's it. Thank you for watching. And thanks especially to Hans Messersmith for digging through all that data and creating all those charts. I could not have done this without you. If you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe so you can see new videos as I create them. I'll see you next time.